Hello, I'm Simon from Kent Libraries, and this is On the Books, the library show born out of lockdown that talks about all things written word, thoughts, ideas, inspirations, and much, much more. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the conversation. Joining us on the books today is Sally Nicholls, the prize-winning author of many books, including Ways to Live Forever and The Silent Stars Go By. So good morning and welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
I'm very pleased that you're here. I like to start my interviews by asking I kind of think it's a bit of an unfair question, actually, but I do like to start this way. So when I was growing up, I had a couple of books that changed my life. I read them and my whole worldview changed. So I'm going to ask you, are there any books that when you read it changed your life?
Not permanently, probably. When I was a child, when I was about 9, it was all kind of Enid Blyton and Arthur Ransom and people like that. And I mean, I don't think they've kind of changed my life permanently, but certainly they did when I was 9. That was a huge part of who I wanted to. I had the George haircut, and I wanted to camp in the garden and all that sort of stuff. I mean, one thing that happens as a writer is you read a book and sort of end up wanting to inhabit that world creatively. So I got very into Dorothy Sayers sort of about 5 years ago, and have then gone on to write 2 or 3 books set in the early Edwardian era. I've got Things a Bright Girl Can Do and A Chase in Time are both set sort of just before and during the First World War, which is a little bit earlier than Dorothy Sayers, but it's that same kind of world. And I've got another one coming out in a couple of months that's set in 1919. So I mean, that hasn't changed my life, in a life sort of way, but that kind of thing happens a lot. It changes your creative life. You sort of go, oh, actually, this is a really fun world to inhabit. Can I do anything creatively with that? You get very interested. People, I think the best writers are writing the sort of books that they love to read. There's no good sort of deciding that you're going to write literary fiction if actually your heart lies in horror, because you'll write much better horror because you'll have a sense of the genre.
That leads me quite nicely into my next question, actually, because I was looking at your back catalogue, obviously, and you do have a lot of books that are historical settings. So yeah, What Girls Do,
yes.
Suffragettes, We All Fall Down, The Black Death. I was quite interested. Close Your Pretty Eyes, obviously, 19th century, and the new one, yes, The Silent Stars Go By, which is turn of the century, isn't it?
Yeah, 1990s. It's Christmas. It's the first time I've done this, really. It's a set over that kind of Christmas period. She's home. The main character is home for Christmas, so it's sort of 1919, early 1920. That kind of 2 weeks around Christmas.
And you've kind of already answered what I was going to ask, which was what made you.
Sorry,
but it's because you like that era and you like to inhabit that world.
I mean, with the well, sort of yes and no. I mean, you get interested in stories. So the Black Death, I wasn't particularly interested in inhabiting medieval England, but I was interested in the story of it. I mean, the Black Death is a much more serious pandemic than the sort that we're currently living through. This, that killed something like 45% of Europe, they think. I mean, it wiped out whole swathes of the population. They used the Black Death when they were planning responses to a nuclear war, because it was the closest thing we had to kind of a level of disaster. I mean, people were literally expecting the world. And there's a bit in Revelations, I looked this up, they said a third of the world will die in plagues. It was worse than Revelations as a catastrophe. I mean, not the Whore of Babylon and the 4 horses of the apocalypse, all that kind of stuff, but people were living through it expecting the end of the world. And I mean, that was just that as a kind of concept for a novel. It was a sort of real life apocalypse novel, really. I thought that was an interest. So sometimes you hear a story or a character or an idea or a concept. I mean, people sort of, you'll know as a children's librarian, there's a lot of books about evacuees and things like that, because it's such an interesting concept for a writer, a child kind of picked up and sent on their own to a stranger's house, and kind of what happens there. It's a good starting point for a story. I'm sort of predicting lockdown is going to be kind of similar, because again, it's quite an appealing setup for a narrative. A child who's off school for 6 months and the parents are off working somewhere else, and what are they going to do with that time? So some of that, I mean, you talk to a lot of historical writers, and they will talk about how much they love doing the research and how excited they are by underpants and this kind of thing. And I'm not really one of those writers. I'm much more excited by the story, and I would kind of like the research to sort of land in my head. I mean, it's interesting. You do find out interesting things, and you find out unexpected things. I'm doing another time slip. I've got this whole series of time slip books for slightly younger children, and you discover, when you look at just like the structure of people's day, you discover how different. I mean, like Georgian England, they don't really have lunch I mean, they would if you were a labourer and needed the food, but in a sort of Jane Austen house, you have your breakfast about 10, and then you have your dinner at about 4, because the candlelight is so expensive. And just kind of, you might have kind of snacks in the middle of the day, but you wouldn't. And just kind of stuff like that is interesting, but it's mostly the story. There is a story to be told in this setting. What do I need to read?
Very driven by story. That's what drives you as a writer.
Well, or I guess kind of situation, ideas. Close Your Pretty Eyes is about attachment disorder, and then it's a story that you can use to explore that situation and what that means to be that child and to feel like that, and kind of what a good story takes a good character-led story takes a character and changes them somehow. In a character-led story, you want to be a slightly different person at the end of the story than you were at the beginning. I mean, obviously, if you're writing detective fiction or something, it's more about solving the murder or having an adventure. But generally, and so you start off with a character and a situation or an idea, and you think, well, how do I want my character to be changed, and what aspects do I want this story to sort of open up, and then you find the story that takes that. But all writers are different, as I'm sure you're realizing. Everybody starts from a different place.
That's the fascinating part of doing this, and that's part of why we're doing it, is to ask similar questions to a load of different writers and just seeing just how different writers are. And it's been really fascinating to see.
It's really interesting. On panels, the first person will say, "Oh yes, your story must start with character," and then the second person will come along and go, "Well, actually, all my stories start with a what if question, and my characters don't really change." And it is.
I mean, I think that's the way writing should be, because everyone.
Yeah, no, completely. Well, you want the range of different stories and ideas, and
So I want to go to The Silent Star Go By. I was very lucky to get a preview copy to have a look at, which is very nice. I mean, you're dealing with a concept that is difficult. Illegal adoption is not an easy subject to tackle in any way. So I suppose I would like to ask, what was the most startling thing that you discovered whilst writing about this topic? What surprised you the most?
Yeah, well, I'd better explain what the book is about for people who don't know it. It's set in 1919, and it's a concept that was actually reasonably common at the time, where my main character is one of the eldest children in the family, and she has a child at 16, and the child is being raised as her youngest brother. So it's sort of exploring how that works as a concept. The child is now 2, and she's coming back home, and just kind of, and I was interested in that because there aren't the rules, the sort of social rule. You know, we have social rules about how a step parent ought to behave, and they're slightly different to how a parent should behave, which is slightly different to how a grandparent should behave. You know, there's kind of, people have these kind of unwritten rules that you can't say that if you're not the parent, but you can say that if you're the parent, but you can't say that if you're the step parent. That kind of, and this just doesn't have those rules. And yeah, I mean, I guess what you've just kind of hinted to is probably the thing that kind of broke that story open, which is that adoption was not legal in this country until 1926. So you could do what the parents do, which, you know, and raise a child as your own. You know, I could say to you, here is this child who doesn't have any parents, and you are this couple who want a child. You know, can this child come and live with you and call you mummy or daddy, and all that. So, you know, and that happened. You know, where there were adoptions, and there were sort of mother and baby homes and workhouses and this sort of thing. But legally, the child always remained the parent. I mean, the book I was reading about, the book I was reading about this said, you know, parents would write to the mother and baby home kind of heartbroken, going, I've changed my mind, I want my baby back. You know, I've got married now, it's okay. And the home would kind of say, oh, it's too late now, you know, the child's been adopted. And actually they were just talking nonsense. You know, the mother had a legal right to that child and could, you know, walk into a family with a child who probably hadn't been told that they were adopted and say, you know, I'm your mother, I want you back. I mean, homes kind of relied on the fact that people didn't know this, and they had these huge complicated adoption forms that everybody signed, and you know, they just kind of relied on the fact that people weren't aware of this. But yeah, legally it wasn't. And what that means for my main character, which is kind of the core of the novel, really, is that her name is on her son's birth certificate as his mother, and that piece of paper is in the house. And I mean, birth certificates weren't as crucial documents then, which is why you got so many stories of boys signing up to the army at 14, because you didn't, you know, people often didn't have a birth certificate, so or they didn't have a paper copy of it. There would be a register of their birth, but you know, that's why you get these stories of children signing up at 14, which kind of wouldn't happen nowadays in the same way. So the child may never find out who she is, but that piece of paper is there in her father's study, and she is trying to negotiate how she can allow him to have a proper relationship with her mother, and allow her mother to have a proper relationship with this child, and to not kind of ruin that. Yeah. But also, how is she supposed to behave to this child, knowing that one day he may well find this piece of paper and realize that he's her mother, and what sort of relationship will he want or expect with her, and how can she, you know, live her life, and I mean, it's something you can really move on from, but you know, accept that this has happened, and sort of incorporate it in her life. And there isn't a rule book for that, and she's somebody who is trying really hard to do right by everybody in the family who's been affected by this, and there isn't a right answer, really. Whatever she does is going to hurt somebody.
That struggle really came through, and the characters really did drive the story, which I was hooked by what I got to read, which was awesome.
Oh, good, thank you.
I know I'm probably aimed at my age group, but the characters caught my attention really quickly.
It's certainly the oldest book that I've written so far. I mean, it's you know, it's about marriage and motherhood. You know, there's an argument that it's kind of clinging on to YA by its fingertips, really.
Tenuously clinging on to YA, yeah.
Tenuously clinging on to it, yeah.
How much do your characters change during the writing? Do you find they take on a life of their own, or do you guide them more?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, sometimes you have this idea for a character, and you realise as you're writing it that doesn't work. So the Isabel in All Fall Down was a boy when I started to write her,
Right.
and it just didn't work. She sounded like a girl, and actually the things that I wanted her to do for the story to worked much better if she was a girl. I mean, she ends up, her parents sort of say, the children go off and live in the barn and that kind of stuff. And actually, as a boy, she would have been out in the fields all day. She wouldn't really know how to deal with that. And that's quite, in order for her to be a sympathetic character, it sort of made more sense that she'd been in the house all day and she knew how to look after her younger siblings and that kind of stuff. So yeah, sometimes you try one thing and it doesn't work. Sometimes you read things and the insights that you gain from that make you kind of reform the narrative. I mean, again, All Fall Down, sort of in a practical sense. When I first, very, very first started writing, before I'd really done any of the research, I kind of thought, oh, well, I've read The Wife of Bath. She got married at 12. Like, this is a thing, maybe my main character will be married at 12, and actually when I started doing the research, I realized that the reason The Wife of Bath getting married at 12 is such an unusual thing is that it's like if two people got married at 16 nowadays. Like, it does happen, but that's very rare. If you said me and my boyfriend got married at 16, everyone would be a bit like, what? You had a house by yourself at 16. Like, how do you know what I mean? It would be, the reason she makes so much of it is because that was so unusual, and actually it would be much more usual to marry in your 20s when you were able to support yourself and able, and the physical work of a farm. 2 12-year-olds couldn't do the physical work as labourers that would be necessary to support a family as a peasant. I mean, it would be quite common for princesses or so forth to be married at 6 or 7, or at least betrothed at that kind of age, but they wouldn't be expected to go off and start their own household at 6 or 7, and they wouldn't be expected to do the physical work of running a house. So there are things like that you sort of start off thinking, oh, it'll be like this, and then you do the research and discover that actually it won't be. And I guess Stanislaus Kostar was a bit like that. One of the books I read when I was researching it was a woman who'd done lots of interviews with women in America who had chosen to give up babies for adoption. Because in Britain, generally speaking, if you give up a child, it's because you have no choice about it. Yeah. We have very few sort of voluntary adoptions in this country, but in America it's much more common because abortion is such a fraught issue in America, and also I guess it's more normalized. It's seen as a much more acceptable thing to do, whereas in this country, which, having read this book, I think is a much more healthy attitude. People are very, very much like, if you can keep this child, that's kind of better for everybody. And the book talked a lot about what a traumatic event this was for a woman giving up a child. And actually the situation that Margot has in the book, she's very fortunate because her child is still there in her life. She can still see him. She can see that she's happy. She can have a relationship with him. And this book that I read was very clear that, part of why it was so traumatic was because you just waved goodbye to your child and never saw them again, and you had no idea where they were or what was happening. And actually, I mean, it sounds like such a fraught situation, having your mother raise your child, but actually in terms of Margot's mental health, that's a much more healthy way of doing it, because he's still there. She's able to see that he's okay. She's able to even have a relationship with him. But yeah, reading it, you do kind of think, actually, this is something that and because it's secret as well, I hadn't kind of got my head around how damaging that is, to keep a secret as big as that. A lot of them talked about this sense of what would people think of me if they found out. People talked about lying to their subsequent children, how difficult that was, that they were hiding this huge and significant thing from their family, sometimes not usually from their husbands, but sometimes from their husbands. So certainly from their younger children, and how much that kind of psychically damages you, this kind of permanently not being able to reveal this huge and fundamental part of yourself. And what a shameful thing it is as well, how much shame people felt about it. And that was kind of, I'd sort of you sort of think about that, but you don't kind of appreciate what a big thing it is until you kind of read about women who've been in that scenario. So yeah, you kind of have to go back and sort of deepen it and go, actually, no, this is a bigger thing than you've kind of acknowledged, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. You were saying about social pressure, or you're alluding to social pressure, and just how much pressure is put on our mental state by society, and the supposed rules that we have to follow, and what's right and what's wrong. I mean, you said that the book brings across that level of struggle really well. Where do you think reading fits in to helping with mental health or hindering with mental health?
Yeah. I mean, for me, a great deal. I mean, that was something I really noticed in lockdown, because I have two small children, and my husband and I are both working at home, and we have a very small house. So that was incredibly stressful, and quite how grounding it was when I kind of said, actually, I'm gonna do some reading every day, and just that kind of escape, and that escape to somewhere that is an exciting and safe place to be. I think emotionally, reading is really important, particularly for children. That being able to have the greater an emotional kind of literacy you have, I think that's really important for mental. I mean, I know they talk about this a lot in terms of men's mental health, that you can't, the BBC did that study where they asked children to describe emotions, and the only one the boys could describe was anger. And you sort of, and these weren't children, in deprived houses or anything like that. This was an ordinary, they obviously had loving parents, and and the girls could all do it. Like, it wasn't that they were growing up in emotionally illiterate families. It was that their sisters were accessing something that they weren't. And I do think reading is a part of that, because I mean, I'm sure you'll know better than me that girls seem kind of culturally able to access books more than boys do. I mean, I don't know if you think.
No, it's definitely anecdotal, and there's definitely statistics that back it up. It's a crazy thing. I think part of it is that stereotype that we're still desperately trying to get away from, where almost that, I suppose, Victorian sort of boys do, like, work outside and play sports and all that sort of. They don't read, and despite years of not actually having a society like that, we're still struggling to overcome that gender stereotyping that happens at such an early age.
And I mean, it has negative consequences for girls as well, because playing outside is great. Like, climbing trees and kicking balls is great as well. I mean, it works both ways. But yeah, I think having the kind of structure and the names for what is happening to you is a hugely powerful, the kind of emotional narrative of what's going on in your head is a hugely important thing to have. And the emotional narrative for what's happening in other people's head. I mean, mental health, we have this idea, whenever you talk about mental health, it seems to go back to the individual. Like, you need to go and have counseling, you need to go and have meditation, you need to go and have, CBT or whatever. But actually, an emotionally strong society is one where, you know, people aren't bullying their classmates, people aren't isolated because they're, you know, they have neighbours who knock on their door and say, are you okay? Or, you know, friends who give them a ring and say, you know, let's go out for coffee. Like, actually, it a more connected and emotionally aware society is one where these problems are less likely to develop. You know, if your school life is being bullied by children whose only emotion is anger, your mental health is going to suffer much more than if you're a class full of children who have been, you know, taught kindness and empathy and all those. So it's all connected. Everything is connected. And yeah, books, they're great.
And books, they're great. I'm glad you said that. I work in a library. Books are great. Anyone who's listening to this, books are fantastic.
We love you. We missed you.
Ironically, because we're doing this over Zoom and the whole laptops and the modern world that COVID really did force on us more than we would have done before.
Yeah, no, completely.
I do like to ask, we live in an age of devices, and you see it everywhere. People glued to their phones, their pads, their laptops. So in an age of devices, does the written word still have a place, do you think?
Well, a lot of what people are doing on devices is reading the written word.
True.
I mean, I know people are playing computer games and so forth, but when, you know, social media is all written.
Yeah.
That's all a written communication. You know, when you're browsing articles that pop up on Facebook or whatever, that's the written word as well. I mean, there's no law that says reading an article on your phone is somehow less literate than reading it in a newspaper or in a collection of essays. You know, I mean, some of the best-selling books of recent times have been bloggers and, you know, turning their blogs into books, and it doesn't magically have more power because it is on paper. I mean, I spend a lot of time online because that's where I work. Yeah. You know, I turn on the computer in the morning and I type in front of a computer all day, and then I turn it off at the end of the day. And, you know, my social circle is a lot of writers who are all doing the same. So I feel like the internet is people in your living room, and people are really positive and really negative at the same time. I mean, it's like, but you know what I mean? I mean, yes, there is bullying and there is shaming and there is, you know, like people having really angry arguments.
Yes.
On the internet. And there is also friendships and romances and education and support. And they did a really interesting experiment apparently where they studied two council estates, one of which had got broadband and the other one hadn't. Right. And they found that the council estate with broadband, people were actually much more connected to the real world because they could apply for jobs. So they had more money. Right. But also they could kind of Google, you know, toddler groups in my city, or, you know, meetups or board games cafes or whatever it was that they were needing, you know, access support for my elderly mother who needs a carer. Yeah. And it was a really, I mean, I'm sure it wasn't a universally positive experience, but there were a lot of positive things that estate were able to access that the other estate weren't.
I mean, I agree. An integral part of libraries now is our e-offering, our electronic offering. We do have a massive electronic.
And that's actually really important for a lot of people. Yes.
Yeah, it totally is. And COVID really showed just how important that actually was. We got a lot more people accessing it because they couldn't get to the physical libraries, so that was good. Yeah. The only criticism I tend to hear, or I've heard from other authors with the device era, is the shortening of the attention span. It can be a real positive and a real negative.
Yeah, I mean, I would be interested to read studies on whether that is a real thing, because I mean, they all said the sort of same thing about the MTV generation, who are now all in their 40s. So I mean, I genuinely, I don't know if it's a real thing or not, and I don't know how much of it is you've just got a phone there. I mean, I can see that if you're reading a book and you just kind of want to check, you know, whether anyone's replied to your post on Instagram or whatever, I can see that being a real thing, but I don't know if you take the phone away, whether actually children in school are less. I mean, anecdotally, things like GCSEs and A levels are getting harder. People are able to do more work. So I would question whether it's a permanent brain effect. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I genuinely don't know. I haven't read. My suspicion would be that it's probably less pronounced than people think it is, and it's probably situational. I mean, being in the middle of an interesting argument on Twitter is a bit like being in the middle of an interesting argument in real life. You know, it's hard to concentrate on your book if you know somebody is being wrong on the internet. You know, you kind of want to get back to it. But I think that's true if you're working in an office as well. I mean, you know, you and I don't work in offices, so my experience of this is limited. But
it's. I see exactly where you're coming from. That makes a lot of sense. It's weird the stigmas we attach. I read somewhere once that every generation is like to complain about the youth of today, going all.
Yes, well, of course they do.
So it's not a new thing. Like youth of today, it's like no, every generation is complaining about what's come after it. It's quite fun. I like to ask about things that are all sorts of things of the people who agree to be interviewed, and I am a massive fan of this. So I am going to ask, how was climbing Mount Doom? And for those of you who don't know, we're talking about Mount Ruapehu in New Zealand, but please.
We are, yes, yeah. Well, I actually, Lord of the Rings film came out about a month before I was in New Zealand, the first one. So I saw it in Australia, and then I went on this kind of I was 18, and I went on this sort of backpacking bus around New Zealand, and there were all these people who were kind of carefully, you know, only packed 4 pairs of underpants or something, with this enormous copy of Lord of the Rings in their backpacks that they were dragging around New Zealand because they'd come to New Zealand and you know they were going to read Lord of the Rings while they were here because it was such a kind of cultural experience. So yeah, that was one of the places that, you know, and you know, we'd be on this bus and you look out the window and you'd be like, yeah, that is Middle Earth right out there. I mean, the scenery in New Zealand is incredible. It's like the Peak District sort of ramped up, you know, times 10. And yeah, this very kind of bleak sort of. I mean, it was a mountain, you know. I like climbing mountains, so it felt like a mountain. But yes, the top was very bleak and black and all this. Sadly, there weren't like the hordes and walks and things. Well, probably sadly for the best.
Lord of the Rings. I have to say, Pete Jackson, when he did that film, I was 22 when it came out, I think, and I had been reading Lord of the Rings. I was given The Hobbit by my mum at 10. And I think I'd picked up Lord of the Rings when I was 14 or 15, and I'd been reading it religiously ever since, and to this day, in fact. And what amazed me about Pete Jackson's film was he's put what's in my head on screen. How did he do that?
The first one particularly, I think, because it's more. Yeah. So they sort of went off a bit in the second and third ones, but the first one and the Hobbit. We didn't get to go and see Hobbiton because the bus tour didn't go there, but it was a really incredible experience. I looked at it.
You did quite a bit of travelling after university, so you went into. I
did 6 months in Japan. Yeah, 6 months in Japan in a Red Cross hospital, and then a month in Australia and a month in New Zealand, which is probably the most adventurous I've been, you know, my whole life.
Did that help inspire you when it came to writing? Just being in other countries, or did it give you any idea?
Not really. I mean, everything ends up inspiring you, I think, as a writer, because you are writing from who you are. I mean, not consciously, but I would be surprised if there wasn't something unconsciously in there.
I do want to ask though, because you are in that position where your first ever novel was made into a film.
Yes.
How was that experience?
Wonderful. I mean, people sort of say your best. I have two best being an author experiences. And one is when I got that first phone call from my agent to say that somebody wanted to buy my book, and all this work had actually pulled off. And the second, we got to go on the set and look around this whole house that they built in Newcastle, of what my child's house was going to, and they'd put he's into airships, so they've got airships in the bedroom, and there were books that they'd his sister likes Sylvanians, so there were some Sylvanians in the house, and just this kind of I'm watching proper, Emilia Fox was there, and proper grown-up actors, and just being you were spending all day because a set. My husband said making a film was a bit like building a house in a day. You have 50 people all there on set. And I was like, there's all these very serious grown-ups, and they're spending all day pretending to be characters from the back of my head. That was really, because when you start writing a book, it's an incredibly personal thing. I mean, it's particularly when you've not been published. That was my first book. It's you on the bus, kind of daydream about these characters, and the idea that they would then become something that had such a literal and physical existence was really weird.
That actually leads me on to an interesting question. How do you cope with ownership? And by that I mean, once it's out there, once it's gone into the public domain, your characters take on lives from everybody else. They add their own stamp onto it or anything like that. How do you get with that was mine in my head, now that belongs to some people it belongs to them entirely? I mean, how do you get around?
You have to accept it, right, to a certain degree, and you have to. People can get quite angry about stuff and go, "Oh, that's not what I intended at all," and sort of, it doesn't matter what you intended if it's not there in the book, and if people aren't. I mean, obviously, if one or two readers are kind of misinterpreting the book, you sort of go, well, okay, that's, if most readers get it, then it's clearly there. But if a lot of people aren't understanding what you've written, you sort of have to accept that you haven't made it clear enough. Right. You haven't put what you wanted to say out there. There was an interest with the Suffragette book. The Suffragette book came out about a year after the Suffragette film, and the Suffragette film got a lot of backlash about the fact that it was so white. Everybody in the film was white, and that was kind of an unfair criticism, because the suffragette movement in Britain was very white. There were one or two very high-profile, non-white suffragettes who have been kind of a bit more celebrated in later years. But in England, it was a very white movement. That's what it was. There were very, very few non-white suffragette campaigners. So sort of that the film and the book were kind of, and I think the reason there was such a backlash is because suffrage in America is a hugely charged issue, because white women got the vote before black women did. There's a lot of kind of racial tension about that, and about how the suffrage movement is portrayed. And so there were a lot of, I think, American black feminists or feminists with an interest in black history who were kind of looking at this film and saying, well, interpreting it through an American lens. Yeah. But I mean, in Britain, it just was. There were one or two very high-powered sort of non-white feminists, but fundamentally, it was a movement of white people, and that's a problem. But that's what it was. So when I wrote the Things a Bright Girl Can Do, that's reflected in the book. I have lesbian characters. I have working class characters. I have a lot of minorities who are represented in the book. I mean, there were loads of lesbians. Yes, movement for obvious reasons. It was a really queer movement, and that's reflected, but sort of for obvious reasons. But and I did, there are a couple of, I do mention some of the big names who aren't white, and the East End of London, where the book is set, was a very diverse place, but diversity meant something different in Edwardian England, which is quite interesting. People will say, oh, there were loads of Irish people there, because Ireland is another country. And actually there is a lot of, well, there wasn't another country then. Actually, I take it back. Ireland wasn't another country then.
They considered it another country.
A lot of kind of anti-Irish, yeah, a lot of kind of anti-Irish feeling in a way that doesn't really make sense to us as now. And a lot of anti-Jewish feeling, and there are Jewish characters in the book, Irish characters in the book, and they're kind of coded white nowadays in a way that, Irish people were white, but there was a different kind of language around diversity. So I felt like I'd sort of put in quite a lot of sort of little references to people, and I'd had characters with kind of Jewish names and Irish names, and I did have one character with a non-white name and this kind of stuff. But also fundamentally, I was describing a culture that was very white. And there were a few people who had kind of picked up on the backlash to the suffragette film, and gone, oh, why aren't there all these black suffragettes in this book? And I did do a thread on Twitter, sort of saying, look, I have referred to some of the people who you said I haven't referred to, but fundamentally, if you didn't pick up on that, that's a problem that that error is on me. If I haven't made this clear enough that you're not noticing it, that's on my shoulders, and I accept that. But also, this was a incredibly complicated book to research. It was a lot of work. I spent a lot of time trying to make sure I got the lesbian experience and the queer experience right, and the working class experience. There are minority. Working class isn't a minority, but it's a minority in Edwardian fiction. Edwardian fiction is all written by vicars' daughters. It is really hard to find. There's very, very little working class. It does exist, but there's very little kind of first person working class writing in Edwardian, because they just didn't have time. Lots of them couldn't write, and those that could write, were down mines all day, or sweeping floors and blacking lead. Like, they didn't have the time to write those books. So I kind of said, look, I've done a lot of research, and I didn't have the time to do Black and Asian voices authentically. This, if you want to write that book, that's brilliant, but that wasn't my book. And that went down quite well. But yeah, I think the internet works much better if you're able to apologize.
Right.
I think the people who seem to work well on the internet are the people who are able to say, yeah, you're right, that's not in the book. There was a thing, Lin-Manuel Manuel, the people were kind of saying, oh, you didn't mention these characters were slave owners, you don't have any Native Americans in Hamilton, you don't have any kind of acknowledgement of the things these people got wrong. And he kind of went, yeah, you're right, I don't. It's a very short musical about an extremely complicated period in history, and I've got everything in there that I had the space to. But you're right, there's some stuff that I missed out, and that is part of the narrative that's not there. And go and write something out. And I'm like, actually, yeah, the people I see who seem to come to most grief on the internet are the ones who aren't able to listen and apologize with feeling and go, yeah, you're right, that's not in my book, maybe it should be, or you're right, there's not in my book, maybe you should go and write a book that's got that in it, because that's my book's doing something different.
You've just come up against an interesting, I'm a big fan of history. I didn't study officially history. As I've grown older, I've read a lot.
It's interesting.
Really interesting. It's fascinating. But it's that I find that the modern era, and this is not to disparage people, but the modern era, when you're writing historical context, and you've got the modern, and the very right modern awareness of all the different minorities and diversity. And
one thing that's quite interesting, I think, is reading historical documents that aren't written by the people in power.
Yes.
because there are a lot of those voices are there. I mean, if you want to write about, you know, women going off and having adventures and being kick-ass and feminist and all that kind of stuff, those women have existed for centuries. You know, there are a lot of kind of Victorians, you know, Victorian female doctors with female botanists, all this kind of stuff. And I mean, you know, one of the obviously for things a bright girl can do, I was reading sort of Sylvia Pankhurst, who was a kind of pacifist socialist, you know, female social entrepreneur who was, you know, spending her time doing all sorts of stuff that was really not very, very, you know, having affairs with Labour politicians. She had a child outside of wedlock. She founded this huge kind of social enterprise and you know, increasingly communist set of stuff in Bow. I mean, she's not somebody who is a traditional Edwardian woman, and reading her writing makes you realize quite how much of history is written by the men at the top. So I think those attitudes are there, but you're right that other attitudes are also there. I mean, you need to kind of, and one of the things I find interesting about writing history actually is the fact that you're writing about then for now.
Yes.
That, you know, if modern children want to read about what Edwardian life is like, they can go and get an Edwardian book off the shelves. You're not actually, I mean, you want it to be accurate, but you also want to be relevant to a modern child. You want to, you know, writing if I wrote the sort of book that's written for Edwardian children about how important it is to settle down and be a good wife and you know, learn how to cook the dinner, like that wouldn't be very relevant to a modern girl. But also a book like one of the books I read was in H.G. Wells' Anne Veronica, which is about a girl who is trying not to do that. You know, she goes off and gets arrested for breaking into Parliament as a suffragist. You know, she wants to go off and be a scientist. Like that's an Edwardian book written by an Edwardian writer, and that is also a true and valid experience. It's not the normal experience, and part of what the book is about, you know, all the people in her life who don't want us to do that. But it's as valid as the story about someone learning how to be a good wife. It's more relevant to a modern reader because that's a struggle that is more relevant to what they're trying to do with their lives.
I completely understand where you're coming from, and I hadn't actually really thought about what you're saying about the fact that actually a lot of history is written by the people at the top who are a very limited, narrow view set.
It's so interesting when you see all the other stories that aren't, you know, that narrative of World War I that we are still being taught in our schools.
Yeah,
it's not that it's false, but it's a very narrow narrative, and it's not the narrative that was true for everybody who was living through that war.
No, and I suppose what you were saying about finding the stories that will resonate with the modern audience, that is really your task as a modern writer for now.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense now you said it. I've only got a couple more questions because I realise that we are barreling through our time rather rapidly, which is a shame because I'm really enjoying this conversation.
Sorry, I talk too much.
No, not at all. I think your answers have been fascinating, really interesting. What book, if any, do you wish you had written?
That I wish I'd written?
Yeah.
Probably at the moment, because I have two small children, that would be Where the Wild Things Are, which is just a perfect. I've read a lot of picture books, and Where the Wild Things Are is in a world of its I mean, I've not read another book that is as perfect to read aloud. So yeah, at the moment, that would be.
Well, it's allowed to change. It's not set in stone, of course. But yeah, I do find that fascinating because obviously, as I've been told by many writers, one of the keys to actually learning to write is to read widely, really widely.
Yeah, of course.
And not necessarily just the stuff that you'd be normally interested in. It teaches you the process. I think Stephen King said once that, you know, part of his learning to write was reading nearly everyone he could get his hands on.
Yeah, no, completely.
Yeah. So it's always interesting to hear what someone says, you know, when they find a book that goes, oh, I wish I'd written that, because that's just, it just resonates, yeah. what authors have inspired you as a creative person?
Yeah, that will vary with each book. So, I mean, things a Bright Girl Can Do and The Silent Stars Go By are both set in a similar time for the sort of the first 20 years of this century. So one of the things I did reading that book was to go and read books that had been written by people who were actually there.
Yeah.
So for Silent Stars Go By, a big influence was Noel Streatfeild's autobiography, A Vicarage Family, which is because the main character is a vicar's daughter, and that's about her life as an Edwardian child. And because she's a writer, she has a real eye for the sort of details of writers' life. She takes you through a whole Sunday in a vicarage, what the things they would do. She talks a lot about the clothes that they wore, the kind of details, she has a whole bit on what a governess's life was like in Edwardian Britain. That was really useful. Another one was a book called Hostages to Fortune, which again, it was about a woman who has her first child in, I think, 1918, 1917, something like that. And it's a kind of history of her children's childhood, which has a lot about the kind of a lot of women's books from this period, because a lot of writers are kind of lower middle class. I mean, obviously you have the writers who P.G. Wodehouse, who's living in his mansion house or whatever, but a lot of writing in this period is women who are teachers or vicars' wives, vicars' daughters. A woman who wrote Hostages to Fortune is a doctor's wife. And so there is an awful lot about the sheer drudge of housework and the sheer impossibility of doing anything else. I don't think we realise quite how much women owe to the washing machine, because that's a whole day of work otherwise, doing a family's wash without a washing machine. I mean, middle class women would have sent that to the laundry. You would have a laundry service if you were a middle class woman. But if you were a working class woman like Nell's mother, Nell talks about being taken out of school every week in order to do the washing, and she's getting 80% of the education that her brothers are getting because she's not in school on Mondays because that's wash day. And that was really useful in terms of the sort of practicalities of a childhood. Obviously, there was another one that was really useful. My mind's gone blank. Yeah, I can't remember. But there was another. Invitation to the Waltz.
Right.
Rosamund Learman, which is a character who is about the same age as Margot, and it's a whole description of her going to a ball and what the ball. I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful book if you are at all interested in teenage girls going to balls in 1920, and that whole kind of social awkwardness. It's a girl. It reads very emotionally, very much like what school disco is like if you're a bit of a wallflower and if you have to wait for a boy to ask you for every dance. But the sort of details of the different people who are there, and again, clothes. Edwardian writers female writers are obsessed with clothes because they are so expensive, and you have to make them yourself, and they have to look right. And if they don't, or hire a dressmaker. But if they don't look right, then that's and you only have 2 or 3 dresses. So it's this whole kind of, Noel Streatfeild is sort of famous for this, the sort of, how are you going to get the audition frock that you need? So yeah, but they're different for different books. Writing is a conversation between different writers. Every book that you read will be drawing on, even if it's not doing so consciously, and particularly sort of genre writers, it's drawing on all the conventions of the genre. I mean, Tolkien spawned a whole genre, really, of writing. But I mean, seriously, there's the kind of high fantasy books are incredibly incredibly kind of genre savvy, and Tolkien wrote that genre.
Yeah.
But he took all of it from, you know, Beowulf and you know, the Norse writers and things like that. So that's what writing. That's what you wouldn't think, you know, oh, Game of Thrones is inspired by Beowulf, but you know, it is because of the way this conversation works.
Yeah, you can definitely draw its DNA. Yeah, and
Yeah.
Tolkien,
And that's really exciting.
Unashamedly.
Yeah. I wrote my second book, Season of Secrets, which Anderson are hopefully going to be reissuing, which is really exciting, is all about sort of pagan mythology. And I remember speaking to a woman in a pagan bookshop and being like, am I allowed to do this? And she was like, that's what paganism is about. It's about taking the stories and turning them into different stories.
I mean, mythology runs through everything. I mean, it always comes back in the end. There's some hymn somewhere.
And it's not stealing. It's threads. It's taking all these different threads and weaving them to make something different.
Well,
writers are.
Sorry, I mean, we've been telling stories as human beings since we were human beings. I think. I mean,
I think you're right. Yeah.
I do, because we do ask people who are who want to get into writing or learning with writing or anything like that. I like to ask the question: how do you overcome the dreaded blank screen or white page?
I think you need to have confidence in what you're writing. I mean, as a professional writer, the deadline is really important. Like, it's when you're a new writer, you have an awful lot of books that are about 4 pages long or 2 chapters long, because you have an idea and you get excited about it, and then actually doing the grunt work is the hard bit. I mean, I wrote my first book on a master's program, so I had a deadline, and I think that Waste to Live Forever is comparatively short, which was really helpful because I was able to sort of say, right, you know, I need to get this book finished by September, and as finished and as polished as I can possibly make it. Whereas the writers on my course who were writing much longer books and were only handing in a chunk of their work, they often didn't get something that was finished, and that was actually a huge problem because they then had to go back into full-time jobs and families and all those other commitments. With this book that you know, they then had to kind of finish around the edges. So having something that was completely finished was a huge gift. And as a professional writer, having a deadline is really important, because writing is really hard. It's really boring. I mean, when I talk to school children, I say, look, you are doing the same piece of homework all day, every day for a year. Like, it's not, bits of it are fun, bits of it are exciting, but a lot of it is just slog, and it's slog through something that isn't very good, because, you know, your first drafts aren't very good. So yeah, having some sort of deadline. I have a friend who used to post me £20 notes, and then she would post me £2,000 a week, and I had to post her back a £20 note. And if she didn't send me the work, then it got sent. She was on the sort of soft level, which she got sent to a charity that she liked. The hard level is you sort of send it to a political organisation you really profoundly disagree with, and you know, you have to get your work done, or you know, the party you really don't want to get into power gets your money. She picked the soft option, which was that it went to a charity she supported. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of writers kind of use tricks like that just to kind of say, look, this is something that needs to be done, and there is a purpose to this.
Makes sense that, you need something to spur you on. Your undergrad was philosophy, is that correct?
Yes, philosophy and literature.
Philosophy and literature. Did studying philosophy, because I'm fascinated with what people study and learn and stuff like that. Education really interests me. I work in a library. I suppose I should be interested in people learning things. Did philosophy in any way help you with writing? Just the study of philosophy and thought?
My first book, I mean, my first book is a sort of philosophical explanation of what happens to you after you die, written for 10-year-olds. Later books, not so much, but I am interested in books with different voices. Things a Bright Girl Can Do is three girls with very different philosophical ideas about everything from conscription to violence in the suffrage movement to kind of, you know, King and Country and all that kind of stuff. And one of the challenges when writing the book was to make each voice as compelling in its own right, even though they profoundly disagree with each other. So, you know, I have one character who's saying that, you know, that war is a ridiculous way to solve conflict, and we all ought to be pacifists, and, you know, this war is a dreadful idea. And I have another one who is sending her fiance off to the front line and, you know, thinks this is a wonderful sacrifice that he's making. And I was trying to believe both those contradictory points when I wrote the book, which is a really interesting challenge as a writer. And I mean, I don't think I quite succeeded, but I am interested in that idea of having different voices in a book that disagree with them, and a novel being a sort of conversation between different experiences and choices. In Silent Stars Go By, you have voices. You don't. Margot is the main character, but you have in the book, you have other women who've made different choices to the choice that she made, and this sort of conversation about which is the right choice and which is the wrong choice, and that sort of thing. Which I guess is a philosophical way of looking at things.
It's very philosophical. It's just fascinating. It's just been really interesting hearing all the different inspirations and drivers behind how people write. It's just really, really interesting stuff. Because we, as consumers of writer, we get the book and we read what you've written, and we see this wonderful thing, or we read it on the screen, but you don't really have a concept of what's actually gone in to produce those words. See. It's like a, you know, baking a cake, or they say making sausages. You know, nobody sees the process; they only see the end product. Yeah. And it's fascinating to hear the process. I'm going to have two last questions for you, and then we're going to have to call it quits. My second to last question is, what do public libraries mean to you?
Well, as a child, they were a huge part of my life. I had two libraries within walking distance of my house, and I used to read a huge amount. You know, they ordered in all of the Famous Five and all of Discworld and all those sorts. You know, I used to go in and be like, I'd like to order 25 books of this series, and, you know, this 9-year-old, and they'd be like, right, you know, okay. Yeah. You know, every Secret Seven, you know, you used to be able to order these little cards. You could order 3 books at a time, and I used to get a whole stack of them and order, you know, the entire Secret Seven series on a stack and hand them back, and they would just kind of politely take this card from the small child and go, oh, of course, no, we'll let you know when they're in. And I can't remember how they let you know in those days, because we didn't have. Maybe they rang you up, or they sent you. Didn't have text messaging or email or anything like that. Maybe they sent you. Maybe they posted you a letter even. Gosh, yeah, I've forgotten. But yeah, I mean, they were a huge, and of course, school libraries as well. As an adult, you know, I have 2 small children, and you cannot buy. This really is brought home to you in lockdown. You cannot buy all the picture books that 2 small children read. And still have space in your house to move. So that's been and both my children love books. And it's been lovely getting reports back from school and nursery and saying, oh yeah, you know, they love reading, they love books, and being like, yeah, you know, thank you libraries, because that's what that is.
Always happy to provide books to children. That's one of the joys of doing this job, is actually seeing kids come in and get their books and be excited. I have to say, it is a real joy of being a librarian, is seeing people be excited about books. So my last question for you then, the last one is, Silent Stars Go By, when's it released?
November.
Brilliant.
Yeah, beginning of November. The perfect book for Christmas. Got a lovely glitter.
And on that note, I want to say thank you very much for joining me today and having a fantastic conversation. It's been really interesting, and good luck with when the Silent Stars Go By, and good luck with wherever you're writing at the moment.
Thank you.
You got to the end. Well done. We hope you enjoyed our conversation with Sally. Her book, The Silent Stars Go By, is available now in the library and anywhere you'd expect to find good books. If you'd like more information on our services, digital and otherwise, then visit our website, kent.gov/libs. If you'd like to follow us on social media, we have a Facebook page linked below. And if you fancy this as a podcast, we have that also linked below. We hope you have a great day. We hope you're well. Goodbye.